There's quite imbalance sitting underneath a lot of crypto networks as we speak right now. And it doesn't show up on the charts. It doesn't trend on social feeds. It doesn't feel urgent. But history shows us that the most dangerous problems are often the ones that feel boring right up until they matter. Most conversations in this space, they orbit always around price. Everything becomes a debate about direction, momentum, or timing. But price is surface level. It's the reflection, not the actual underlying structure. And what actually determines whether a system survives over time or not is much simpler and much harder to see. Incentives, who gets paid, why they get paid, and what that payment actually buys the actual system. Because here's the uncomfortable truth in all this. A network can look active, liquid, and successful on the front, but while quietly weakening underneath. That kind of decay doesn't announce itself open aloud. It doesn't crash the system overnight. It shows up slowly through small incremental misalignments that just compound over time. Mission 70 exists because the internet computer has reached a point where basically those misalignments matter more than the actual growth metrics. Because in the earliest phases of any network, for instance, survival is a priority. Liquidity is scarce, participation is fragile, of course. It's growing. Incentives are intentionally generous. Passive behavior is tolerated because the attention itself is valuable. Obviously, growth comes first in ecosystems, but efficiency comes later. And that phase made sense. It served its purpose. But systems that never leave the bootstrap mindset eventually pay a price. So what's once, say, helped growth start, for instance, attracting behavior, that weakens governance. What once incentivized, say, participation starts rewarding indifference. Durability is a different goal entirely, because durability doesn't care about, say, short-term numbers. It cares about who stays when rewards shrink, who shows up when the decisions get actually uncomfortable, and also who carries risk when outcomes aren't guaranteed. That's the lens Mission 70 applies, because inflation is often misunderstood because it feels, say, abstract. It doesn't feel like a cost, but inflation in itself is a bill the system pays every single day. Every unit issued is dilution borne by someone else. The question here is never whether inflation exists or not. The question is whether inflation is buying something worth paying for. In a healthy system, for example, inflation buys security, it buys legitimacy, it buys participation that actually matters. But in an unhealthy system, inflation buys time, and time always eventually runs out. We always have a limited amount of it. And right now, issuance flows to a wide mix of participants. We're talking long-term believers, casual participants, yield-focused capital, neurons that vote, neurons that never do, neurons that exist purely because the math works. And this mix produces outcomes that aren't surprising in itself. Persistent sell pressure, dilution for committed holders, governance that grows heavier without actually becoming smarter. And we're talking a widening gap, say, between responsibility and also reward. Inflation is meant to protect the network, but protection only works when the people being paid actually care about the long-term outcomes. And I can tell you from my time observing traditional financial markets, one lesson became impossible to ignore. The most dangerous capital. It wasn't the reckless capital. It's the indifferent capital. I can tell you, large pools of money sit inside systems, not because anyone believed in them, but because returns were just convenient. Participation didn't mean conviction. It meant arithmetic. And when the arithmetic, I can tell you, changed, that capital didn't complain. It didn't argue. It left. The system that relied on it were exposed overnight. Because passive capital behaves the same way in governance. It adds way without accountability. And that increases complexity without improving judgment because it widens the surface area for failure without strengthening decision making. And that's why Mission 70 treats passive participation as a design flaw, not a moral failure in itself, because systems, they don't care about intent. They respond to the incentives. And if participation is optional, participation will be inconsistent, of course. And over time, what does that do? Inconsistency. What does that lead to? It becomes fragility. And at the center of Mission 70 is a clear alignment benchmark, or at least 70% of rewarded stake should be long duration and governance active. This number isn't symbolic, okay? It reflects how mature systems stabilize. Because most of the rewarded capital needs to be locked in, paying attention and exposed to long-term consequences. Security budgets only work when rewards, say, by commitment instead of optional engagement. So to reach, say, that threshold, okay, incentives can't be flat. They can't treat all capital as equally valuable. Pressure has to be applied where it reduces waste without, say, weakening the actual underlying foundations. And that's why Mission 70 introduces a tier neuron framework. Okay? The first tier consists of long-term anchor neurons. These neurons lock capital for many years. They vote consistently or delegate responsibly in that process. They accept the liquidity in exchange for influence. And these neurons reduce exit risk. They dampen the underlying sell pressure. They also stabilize governance. Because I could tell you in traditional finance terms, this patient capital, the kind that doesn't move, say on headlines, the kind that, say, absorbs the volatility instead of amplifying it, there's one thing I experience also in traditional finance taught me is that stability in itself, it doesn't come from activity. It actually comes from your commitment. The most important capital is rarely the loudest. It doesn't chase. It stays dormant. It doesn't chase. It doesn't panic. It stays there dormant because it believes in structure. And systems built on that capital, okay, they behave differently under stress. They bend instead of breaking. And Mission 70 treats these neurons as underlying infrastructure. They are protected. They are the last exposed to emission reductions because they provide the most security per unit of underlying issuance. The second tier consists of, say, mid-term neurons. These lock capital for a few years, okay? Participation, say, exists, but it's uneven. Sometimes they vote, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they delegate, sometimes they don't. And sometimes they disengage. These neurons, okay, contribute value, but they don't anchor governance. But the goal here isn't punishment, okay? It's normalization. Reward advantages are compressed, of course. Yield gaps narrow. Incentives, what do they become? They quietly encourage longer commitments. I can tell you, I saw this pattern play out repeatedly in traditional markets, institutions rarely force behavior. What they do is reshape incentives until the desired behavior becomes the rational choice. We could say over time, habits change, yet without confrontation. And Mission 70 applies that same kind of logic. And the third tier here is where most of the, say, adjustment happens. We're talking short term and inactive neurons here. Dissolve delays under a year. Minimal participation, behavior driven, mostly by yield math. And this tier absorbs the majority of the actual emission reductions in all of it. Governance weight also is reduced. Participation becomes required to retain meaningful rewards. Because this isn't about, shaming. It's about efficiency. Capital that does not remember secure governance doesn't need to be paid like it does currently. Structurally, this is like, say, removing excess weight from parts of a bridge that don't carry the actual load. The bridge becomes safer, not actually weaker. And participation under Mission 70 stops being a bonus. It becomes a requirement. Voting directly or, for instance, delegating responsibly is the baseline expectation. So in a mature system, an ICP is going into that maturity phase, inactivity isn't neutral. It increases risk. The shift changes. The psychology of rewards stop feeling like entitlements and they start functioning like actual compensation for responsibility. And this is where tension enters the conversation in all of this. Because Mission 70 doesn't just propose, technical tweaks. It implies a philosophical shift, say from rewarding presence to rewarding contribution. So from paying for capital to paying for alignment. And that shift is where implementation styles actually matter. Because the ICP gang framework, is explicit. It sets a measurable target, say 70% alignment, inflation framed clearly as a security budget, inactive capital treated as structural risk, emission cuts focused where they reduced sell pressure and also governance fragility. Say a more cautious approach, often expected from Definity, likely avoids hard numbers because it prefers encouragement over actual enforcement, gradual curves over sharp adjustments, broad rebalancing also instead of concentrated pressure. The difference isn't, about intent. It's about risk, underlying tolerance. Because I could tell you from my experience in TradFi, one uncomfortable truth stands out. Institutions often know what needs to be done way before they actually do it. The delay isn't ignorance. It's fear of backlash. Nobody wants to create, say, visible losers, but systems, don't reward hesitation forever. Governance, legitimacy isn't about how many, say, votes are cast. It's about accountability in all of it. Stake without engagement is like, say, shareholders who never attend meetings but still swing outcomes. And over time, trust erodes in that type of system. And institutional responses to structural change are usually very quiet because incentives are adjusted behind the scenes. Participation rules tighten. What happens to risk exposure? It is reduced. The public rarely notices until the system behaves better under the stress it's on. And from a long-term structural perspective, we could say Mission 70 isn't about maximizing returns. It's more about minimizing fragility. And this is where we can say, from my institutional finance, offers one more lesson that matters deeply here. Because what mattered wasn't the timing, in my experience. It was the actual structure. Firms that survived in finance weren't the fastest. They weren't the loudest, but they were the most aligned. They paid for stability instead of excitement. And Mission 70 applies that same kind of discipline because it asks whether issuance is still buying security or whether it's quietly becoming a tax on the actual most committed participants. And that question sets up the real challenge ahead. How systems say evolve once growth is no longer the primary concern? Because I can tell you, every system eventually reaches a moment, okay, where growth stops being the hard problem in all of this. And the hard problem becomes discipline. Because in early stages, almost any incentive works. Because the system's empty, participation feels meaningful because scarcity does the work in all of it. But once a network matures, okay, once capital pools grow and say governance surfaces expand, discipline replaces expansion as the defining challenge. Because this is the phase the internet computer has entered. And it's the phase where most systems fail quietly, not through hacks, not through regulation, not through technology. They fail through drift. And I can tell you from my experience in traditional finance, drift is deadly because it's invisible. Like I watched institutions accumulate complexity without improving resilience. More committees and more participants, more instruments, and yet decision quality didn't improve. Risk didn't shrink at all. It just spread thin enough to feel manageable until it wasn't. And crypto governance is especially vulnerable to drift because it confuses activity with actual underlying alignment. As votes increase, proposals pass, participation metrics look healthy, but responsibility isn't evenly distributed in the process. Accountability dissolves also into averages. Mission 70 exists to reverse that trend completely before it hardens. Because once drift becomes cultural, fixing it gets exponentially harder in itself. Because one of the most dangerous myths in, say, decentralized systems is that all stake is equal, okay? On paper, stake looks fungible. One token equals one vote. One neuron equals another. But in practice, capital behaves differently, depending on many different variables on the time horizon, conviction, and its exposure. Short-term capital amplifies volatility. Long-term capital, can say, absorbs it. Passive capital also dilutes accountability. Active capital concentrates it. Treating them, say, identically is not fair in the whole process. It's blindness. Because I can tell you in TradFi, this distinction is explicit. Because lockups matter, yeah. Mandates matter. Fiduciary responsibility changes behavior and all that. Because capital that can leave tomorrow does not behave like capital that must stay through cycles. And Mission 70, okay, formalizes that also. Reality instead of pretending it doesn't exist. And at its core in all this is about who the network is willing to pay to be in the room when hard decisions are made. Governance isn't free. It consumes attention, judgment, and reputational risk. So the idea that governance can be safely subsidized by people who aren't paying attention is a structural contradiction in itself. You don't want a jury where half the members aren't listening. It's useless. You don't want a board where most directors, they rock up, they show up for dividends, but skip meetings. And yet many crypto systems are designed exactly that way. Mission 70 forces a choice. Either you participate meaningfully or accept reduced influence and rewards. that choice reshapes behavior over time. As I could tell you from an institutional lens, that is a classic principal agent correction. Because I could tell you when agents are rewarded, okay, regardless of their effort declines. When compensation reflects responsibility, alignment improves. And what that cause, none of this is punitive. It's corrective. You know, one of the criticisms in all this is that Mission 70 will inevitably face is that it discourages smallholders, okay? Misunderstands the goal because the system doesn't need everyone to be a governor. It needs enough committed governors to secure the actual underlying outcome. And smallholders are not excluded in that process. They're encouraged to delegate to trusted participants who are active, informed, and accountable. Because delegation isn't abdication, it's a specialization, because I could tell you, from TradFi, retail investors, they don't run pension funds. They allocate to managers whose incentives are aligned with long-term outcomes. My job was aligned to get those returns for my clients. The system doesn't collapse because not everyone votes. It stabilizes because responsibility is concentrated where expertise exists. And that's key because Mission 70 moves ICP governance in that direction where delegation becomes meaningful. Follow relationships, comes reputational assets. Governance participation becomes something that you do deliberately, not accidentally. And that shift matters more than any single parameter change. And another concern often raised is liquidity. Obviously, lockups reduce flexibility, longer dissolves delays, for example, increase perceived risk. That's true, okay? And that's the point in all of it. Liquidity is not free. It's a trade-off in the whole process. Because in early stages, liquidity, what does it do? It attracts participation, of course. And in mature systems, excess liquidity, what does that do? It destabilizes governance. Capital that can say exit instantly has no reason to internalize long-term consequences. Because I could tell you from my experience in TradFi, and I learned this lesson the hard way, after repeated crises, lockups, capital requirements, and stress tests weren't ideological choices. No, they weren't. They were survival mechanisms. Because Mission 70 applies that same kind of logic, namely instead of retroactively. It asks participants to decide what kind of capital they want to be in. Do you want, for example, optional upside with minimal responsibility? Or, for example, do you want influence, stability, and actual long-term alignment? Both can exist, but they cannot be rewarded equally. That's the key here. Because the brilliance of the framework is that it doesn't force uniformity, okay? It creates gradients, incentivizes slide rather than snap. Behavior adapts obviously organically because over time, the composition of what is staked changes. Soul pressure declines not because of, say, artificial restrictions, but because the rewarded stake is actually less likely to sell. Think about it. Governance improves not because more people vote, but because the people voting, what do they have? They have more at stake, more information, and more underlying exposure. And this is where the long-term macro implications become impossible to ignore. A network with a stable governance. Capital behaves differently in crisis. When regulatory pressure increases, it doesn't fragment. So, for example, when markets panic and we see red, it doesn't hemorrhage liquidity. When hard upgrades are required in the ecosystem, it doesn't stall. So from a capital markets perspective, this, I could say, matters from my experience because institutions don't allocate based on narratives. They don't. They allocate based on durability. They want to know who actually controls the system when stress hits or when shit hits the fan. They want to know whether incentives collapse under pressure or they actually hold up in all of it. Because Mission 70 is a signal, okay? It tells serious capital that the internet computer is moving out of experimental phase and into the infrastructure phase. And infrastructure capital behaves differently. It accepts lower short-term yields in exchange for predictability. It values governance, clarity. It avoids systems where outcomes are hostage to indifferent participants. And this is where ICP separates itself from networks, still optimizing for optics. There's also, we could say, a deeper philosophical layer to all this that deserves attention, that's not really spoken about. Because decentralization isn't about, maximizing participation. It's about minimizing single points of failure. That includes, for example, governance failure. A system, say, where outcomes depend on disengaged actors is fragile by definition. A system where outcomes depend on committed, accountable participants is resilient, even if participation is narrower. Mission 70 chooses resilience over popularity, and that choice is uncomfortable. I know, because it requires maturity. Mature systems accept trade-offs. They stop pretending all behaviors are equally valuable. They also stop subsidizing inefficiencies in the name of inclusivity. Because I can tell you from my experience in TradFi, the system that survived centuries, they weren't democratic in every layer, okay? They were accountable where it actually mattered. And ICP governance is evolving towards that reality. And this is what's going to drive institutional money flows. And now this brings us to the climax of the argument here. The real question isn't whether Mission 70 is perfect, okay? No framework is perfect. We can sum that up. The real question is whether the internet computer is willing to acknowledge that incentive. Misalignment, say, is now a bigger risk than adoption, okay? And that's the inflection point we're in. Because if the answer is yes, for example, then Mission 70 or something, say, very close to it is inevitable. If the answer is no, then inflation continues to leak value. Governance then continues to bloat, and also fragility accumulates silently, and that's a lot of waste. Because systems rarely fail because of they choose the wrong solution. They fail because they avoid choosing at all. So from everything I've seen across TradFi, I can tell you the winners weren't the ones who delayed hard decisions. No. They were the ones who acted before pressure made the choices for them. Because Mission 70 is proactive, okay? It doesn't wait for crisis. It doesn't wait for capture. It doesn't wait for erosion to show up in the whole process. On the charts, it treats incentive alignment as preventative maintenance, because preventative maintenance never looks urgent until the day it suddenly is. And that's the key issue. So where does this actually leave ICP in all this? If implemented thoughtfully, the result is a governance layer that looks less like a speculative experiment and more like a digital institution. One where issuance is a security budget, not a subsidy. One where participation is intentional, not accidental. One where long-term capital anchors outcomes instead of chasing yield. That's not just good for the price. It's good for survival and also institutional adoption, because in the end, the networks that last aren't the ones with the most users or the highest emissions or the best technology, the ones that still function when conditions change, they're the ones built to endure boredom, volatility, and scrutiny. Mission 70 is about building that kind of system, not flashy, not viral, but durable. Durability is the most undervalued asset in crypto. The internet computer is no longer asking whether it can grow. Not at all. It's asking whether it can govern itself under actual pressure. And Mission 70 represents a recognition that incentives must evolve alongside scale. And that's where we're going to get the mass adoption through scale. That rewarding everyone equally is not the same as rewarding what matters. And that long-term survival demands uncomfortable honesty. Because this isn't about ideology, not at all. It's about structure. And structure always wins in the long run. And that's where we get the mass adoption. Mission 7 is not about punishment. It's about correction. Every durable financial system eventually runs into the same wall over time. Rewards must buy real security, or they slowly turn into a weakness. For years, okay, ICP's issuance did what it was designed to do, okay? It helped bootstrap the network, helped building it from the ground up, attract early capital, and push decentralization forward. That phase worked. It was brilliant. It got us off the ground. And now that phase is over, okay? And you want your mass adoption. You want the price to go up. What comes next is harder because durability depends on alignment. Governance, it depends on participation. And inflation only makes sense when it pays for responsibility. And Mission 70 draws a clear line between capital that strengthens the network and capital that simply sits inside it. That line isn't moral, it's structural. Because long duration governance, active neurons, lower risk, reduce cell pressure, and make the actual system harder to capture. Because passive capital doesn't do that, even if it means well, okay? Because inflation isn't free. It's not a free lunch. Every token you issued either reinforces the system or slowly erodes it to the ground. Mission 70 is simply asking issuance to earn its place, to earn it. So when people frame this, okay, and they frame this conversation as growth, say, versus restriction, they're missing the freaking point here. This isn't about shrinking participation at all. It's about maturing it. We're in a maturing phase, and that real shift is happening here. This isn't a debate about yields, okay? It's a conversation about, okay, legitimacy. And that legitimacy is going to bring institutional adoption with a big capital flow. It's about whether governance power comes with responsibility and about whether the internet computer, the world computer, is built to survive, not just expand. And that's the story behind Mission 70. Because everything, okay, comes together when you see incentives for what they really are, the quiet force that decides whether systems last or collapse. And with that, okay, we wrap up today's journey, okay? And remember this perspective. The next time incentives look harmless on the surface, structure always matters more than the actual noise, because that's where it's going to drive the mass adoption from the institutional investors. Remember, if this video cut through the noise and actually gave you clarity, not hype, not hopium, then do 3 things for me right now. Hit like, so this video reaches people who are actually tired of being misled. Subscribe, because this channel is about understanding where technology, money, and power are actually going before the headlines actually catch up. And comment with what clicked for you, or say what you want broken down next in any video I do. I'll read every comment if it's a valuable comment and it doesn't waste my time. And if you want signal instead of noise perspective, instead of panic, and clarity before consensus also, subscribe now. Subscribe to the channel as I do my best to drop alpha. And remember, ICP, we're going to maturity phase, and for the next phase of growth, this is what we need to attract institutional capital. Institutional capital will take ICP to the next level. So it needs to restructure itself for that reason. And remember to stay decentralized, and I will see you on the internet computer. Until next time.